Kimberly Austin for Rock Book Show. We're actually here in Strawberry Fields, and I'm here with the author Keith Elliot Greenberg, author of December 8th, 1980, the day John Lennon died. Keith, thank you for being with me.
Thanks a lot, Kimberly.
Well, it's a pleasure to have you here and to be in this surrounding as well to talk about your book. Let's just start with why you decided to write the book.
Well, I guess I wanted to create a snapshot of a time in New York City history that's faded. You know, the city's a very transient place. As you can tell by my accent, I'm a lifetime New Yorker. And New York was a very different place in 1980. It was a much more of an untamed place. But it was that type of chaos, perhaps, that drew John Lennon in. That was the New York that John Lennon loved. Clearly, Yoko still loves New York. She obviously lives across the street from where we're sitting right now. But initially, when they were going through some tumultuous times, it was the New York of the 70s and the early 80s that I think appealed to them the most.
Yeah, they really did become a fabric of this city. And Sean, you would see playing with kids here, and they had their favorite local haunts. And that day, what I loved about your book is the fresh perspective you gave that day and the way you wove in other people's stories to what happened.
And that's because I believe that the death of John Lennon was something communal. We all felt it. There was communal suffering, and in the case of New Yorkers, there seemed to be communal involvement. We all somehow seemed to be tied to the death of John Lennon. Prior to that, John Lennon had become a staple of New York, and everywhere you went, people had their, hey, I ran into John Lennon on 72nd Street story, or I saw John Lennon with his son in Central Park. So people felt that he very much was part of the fabric of this city. And therefore, when he was murdered in this city by somebody who was not a native New Yorker or even a resident New Yorker, it hit us very hard.
You're talking, of course, about Mark David Chapman. The research that you did on him and then what you put into the book was absolutely so compelling. And of course, you are a true crime writer as well. What did you glean from your research into him and reading the transcripts of the court case?
I believe Mark David Chapman, and I've said this before, is mentally ill. And I think that, did he know that what he was doing was wrong? I think he knew it was wrong, but I'm not sure about how much self-control he really had. Because he had contemplated, as I say in the book, murdering himself and maybe gaining notoriety that way. But then he assumed that, well, that story will be out of the papers in a day or two or a week or two. Who am I anyway? Whereas if he killed John Lennon, he would achieve immortality, and sadly he has. Interestingly, there are John Lennon fans who refuse to say Mark David Chapman's name out loud. And when the book initially came out and I was promoting the book, I'd be told by the publicist, well, this radio station will have you on the condition that you do not say the name Mark David Chapman.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but he did hang out here for a few days before he did actually shoot John Lennon. But wasn't he here and went somewhere else and came back?
Yes, he was living in Hawaii, and he came here, and he felt this compulsion to kill John Lennon. And then he was married, and he had, from all accounts, a very nice wife, and who had become a fundamentalist Christian and believed in standing by her husband. And she's still with him, as a matter of fact. And he called her, and he told her, he confessed, that he had come here to murder John Lennon, and she told him to come home. So he came home to Hawaii, and the crisis appeared to be over. But after a few days, those voices began to percolate once again in his head, and he got back on a plane and returned to New York, interestingly, with a gun in his suitcase.
Another interesting thing that I saw in the book for the first time was that he had had interaction with Sean.
Yeah, which is pretty frightening when you think about it. He had seen Sean Lennon, who at the time was only 5 years old, coming into the Dakota, and he said, oh, what a cute little boy. And he had shaken Sean Lennon's hand. This was not an odd appearance. John Lennon, again, was part of this neighborhood. And John Lennon and his child were well known in this neighborhood, and plenty of fans introduced themselves to Sean Lennon. In this case, Sean Lennon shook hands with a man who would murder his father hours later.
Incredible. And actually, as you read your book, you think Hollywood couldn't have written this day for John Lennon. And one of the things is that the iconic Annie Leibovitz photo of him nude wrapped around Yoko was taken that day.
Right. It was a day, you would think that if I was writing a fiction, I would have that occur that day, and people would say, oh, come on, you're condensing everything into one day. But indeed, that was a very special day for John Lennon. They had taken that photo, and he was also in the recording studio with Yoko that day, and he was carrying the session tapes out of the vehicle when he was murdered.
And another thing that you bring up in the book is how he had changed as a father and how important that was to him to be different as a father to Sean than he was with Julian.
Right, because as most people who follow John Lennon's life story know, John Lennon was not a very good father initially. Julian Lennon was born at the height of Beatlemania, and there were forces pulling John Lennon in directions away from the family. And so Julian Lennon grew up feeling this enormous absence in his life, and in some ways there might be a parallel to John, whose own father walked out on him when he was very young. So John Lennon really didn't know how to father in the first place, and then he became a celebrity and was completely unprepared, and I don't think anybody would be prepared to be a Beatle. But by the time Sean Lennon was born, this was a birth that was planned, and John Lennon had matured. He was no longer a Beatle. He had been through his crazy phases, and he devoted himself to being a stay-at-home father. You know, I'm not a stay-at-home father. Most people don't have that luxury. It's interesting that he used his wealth to actually enrich his child's life, and I think from what everyone says about Sean, and if you ask anybody who lives around here and grew up around him, he's a very well-adjusted adult now, not to mention a very good musician, and I think that John Lennon's early influence played a role in that.
Yeah, he had been a house husband for 5 years. It's incredible.
Yeah, for 5 years he raised his son, and I think that's why Sean was left with these very sweet, enduring memories, and he also wrote songs about his child. So, you know, those were love letters that he left for Sean.
What were some other new things that you found in your research that are in the book that people might be surprised to learn?
Well, what I found the most interesting was that most likely if John had lived, I think we would have found we would have experienced a reunion at least between John Lennon and Paul McCartney. In fact, they had gone so far as to inquire about applying for the proper permits to stage a concert here in Central Park. So this was not, it had gone beyond the fantasy phase, and I think they were probably ready at that point. Realize John and Paul actually did have a great deal in common. Besides sharing their Liverpool pedigree, both of them had lost their mothers when they were teenagers, and I think they shared that deep sense of pain, and both of them ultimately married women who they wanted to be with all the time. They were not, neither man was going off and leaving his wife at home. By the time Paul was with Linda and John was with Yoko, they wanted to be with the love of their lives. And, you know, so they had a lot in common. And by 1980, they were both family men, and they shared that. And I think they were in a place where they were ready to reunite. John had been praising Paul.
You've been a Beatles fan since you were 5. Did it still, though, surprise you at all how many people came out into the street to mourn together?
I think so. I think I was surprised by the spontaneity of the people just coming out. And again, there was no Twitter or Facebook. Nobody put up a message, hey, we're all gathering at the Dakota. People just appeared. And the New York City Police Department had placed 2 squad cars in front of the Dakota. They figured, okay, maybe, 35, 40 hardcores will show up. They're probably a peaceful bunch. We'll have 4 officers there. That's, what would that be? That would be like 1 officer for every 10 people. And eventually, they'll move on. They didn't realize there'd be tens of thousands of people, that people started traveling in from out of state. And that was something very genuine. And I'm not so sure that anything like that will ever quite be repeated, because we live in an era of social media, and that influences people's actions now.
It doesn't seem that long ago when it was 30 years ago.
It doesn't seem that long ago to me. I speak to people who weren't born at the time.
I forgot about them.
Yeah, and it seems far more abstract to them. But when I was writing the book and I was reliving those days, I could really feel what it was like. And that was what I tried to pass on in the book. I wanted people to know what New York City felt like on December 8th, 1980.